Good afternoon and welcome to the Dawson's Great Lakes Museum. I'm going to start here at the pilot house. And what I usually do with my students to get them tied in, I say, all right, who's heard of a football team called the Detroit Lions? They all raise their hands. And my next question usually is, who owns the Detroit Lions? Nothing. So I give them a little hint. Look over my shoulders. On the lower portion of that sign, you'll see something that says SS, and they all go, SS William Clay Ford. William Clay Ford was the owner of the Detroit Lions. Of course, he passed away a couple of years ago, and his wife Martha now owns the team. But this pilot house, which we're going to go into in a minute, was named after, the freighter was named after William Clay Ford. Henry Ford had a son, Edsel, and Edsel had 3 sons and a daughter. Edsel and Henry Ford decided to have a fleet of freighters because his concept of building automobiles was to bring the raw iron ore from up on Lake Superior down through the lakes, right by our windows out here at the museum, down to the Rouge plant. He'd bring raw iron ore in one side of the plant and cars out the other side of the plant, and that's essentially what he did. So he decided he'd have his own fleet of freighters, or cargo haulers, that they would take the iron ore down, deliver to his plant. And he named 3 of the vessels after his grandsons. One was the Henry Ford II, one was the Benson Ford, and one was the William Clay Ford. Now, Edsel had a daughter, Josephine. She didn't get a freighter named after her because they thought it was unlucky or bad luck at the time to name a freighter after a woman. But that has changed. Now there are freighters named after women. They always named other ocean-going vessels and tugboats and everything after women too. But so there are now Great Lakes freighters named after women. But behind me, we have the pilot house, as I mentioned before. And in 1984, the Ford Motor Company deemed that this vessel was obsolete. It did not have self-unloading equipment, which is the big conveyor belt that swings out and delivers the cargo to the shore. This vessel, you would have had hatches, and they would have to use big clam buckets to go down in the holds, lift the ore out, and deposit it on the shore. So it was time consuming, because we have to remember that these freighters are cargo haulers. They're big dump trucks. And the faster that they can get their cargo, bring it down and unload it, turn around and go back and get more, the better, the more profits for the company. So this vessel did not have that equipment. It was cheaper for the Ford Motor Company to get rid of this vessel rather than convert it and to go out and buy a used vessel with the self-unloading equipment on it. So it was rendered obsolete. There was nothing wrong with the vessel. It was in real good shape. They took very good care of it, but they decided they would get rid of it. Fortunately for the museum, before they scrapped the whole vessel, we were able to go and had a crew cut it away from the vessel. They loaded it, lifted it up with a crane, loaded it on a barge, brought it up the river. We had a special foundation built for it on this lower level and set it down here. So this is an artifact. This is an actual artifact from the freighter itself. We did not recreate this. The Ford Motor Company had this fleet of vessels. There are other ore carriers that delivered cargo, or I should say iron ore, to the Ford Motor Company also. So when it was rendered obsolete, we fortunately here at the museum were able to get it. Of course, now we're in the lower portion of the pilot house, or wheelhouse sometimes they are called on freighters. On naval ships, they call them the bridge sometimes, but we call it the pilot house or wheelhouse. What I'm standing in front of in this lower section, I just like to stop and pause on this big panel that we have here, and it shows the engineer's panel that controls all the mechanical aspects of the ship. And I usually stop my students here, and I say, what looks on this panel looks like it doesn't belong here? Many times I get, well, this lock here, well, that doesn't count. But I say, what looks like it doesn't belong here? Many times they'll say, oh, the digital counter. I said, no, that belongs there. And so I kind of stand here, and then I say something that's, it's kind of a Where's Waldo thing. And usually the younger ones, 3rd, 4th graders go, SpongeBob. And the adults take a while. I usually have to go, it's over by my head, get a little closer, you're getting warmer. So SpongeBob is there. Maybe the chief engineer or one of the men that worked in the engineering spaces had a son or a daughter or grandchild had SpongeBob up there. So I thought it was kind of cool. Because the first time I did this, a 3rd grader was down here, first thing they said was, what's SpongeBob doing up there? And I'm like, what are you talking about, So by that time, you're all paying attention, let's go. So now we are in the lower section again, as we still are, and as you can see, the ceiling, which is called an overhead on a vessel, you can see all the wires for communication and controlling the ship throughout. These are the actual bulkheads over here. The metal walls on a ship, walls are called bulkheads, ceilings are overheads, and of course the floor is the deck. And what I like to talk about down here, though, is the special relationship that the William Clay Ford, our vessel, had with another vessel called the Edmund Fitzgerald. I usually ask, who's ever heard of the Edmund Fitzgerald? And if it's adult group, most do. If it's children's group, no. So I go into a little more detail about that. The Edmund Fitzgerald was an ore carrier, much like ours, very similar to it. And it was used for hauling cargoes from up on Lake Superior down here to the steel mills of the Rouge or Great Lakes Steel and so forth. But the night of November 10th, 1975, there was a huge storm blowing out on Lake Superior. And it was a storm of hurricane proportions. And the two vessels were getting ready to leave Minnesota and Wisconsin carrying their cargoes of ore. One was the Edmund Fitzgerald, and the other one was called the Arthur M. Anderson. Both were ore carriers, and they both had full loads. And the two captains decided to stay together, so they knew there was a storm blowing on the lakes. It was blowing out of the northeast, so we had all this way to build up heavy seas on Lake Superior. So the captains set out on the 9th of November. They decided they'd make a beeline for the Canadian shore over here because the wind was blowing out of the northeast. The waters would be calmer over on the leeward side of the land. And then they would start heading down toward Whitefish Bay and eventually down to the St. Mary's River into the Sioux Locks. With kids, I explained to them what the Sioux Locks are, that they're large channels, elevators on the water. And the ship would come in, so say it's coming from Lake Superior, it would be high, it would come in. The gate would close on the north end of it. The ship would be lowered just like an elevator, and then it could proceed down to Lake Huron, which was about 28 to 32 feet lower than Lake Superior because they could never get through the rapids. So they built the locks to get through. So the two ships, that was their path that they were going to take. Two captains were communicating with each other on the radio, but they were taking a pretty good beating out there. The Fitzgerald lost its radar during the transit of the lake, and so they decided to make the turn and start heading down toward Whitefish Bay. As luck would have it, the no luck they had that night, the wind shifted about that time and started coming a little out of the northwest, which was put the wind at their backs, so it was pushing the vessels. They were, which is, if you know anything about using ships or boats or whatever, if the seas are behind you, it kind of makes your ship a little unwieldy because it's pushing you. And that's kind of what happened to the two freighters. But they made the turn. They got almost to Whitefish Point, and the Arthur Anderson, Captain Bernie Cooper, was in contact with Captain Ernest McSorley of the Fitzgerald. And the Captain Cooper radioed him, "How are you doing, Captain?" And he said, "We're holding our own. Our bow rail is down, but we're holding our own." And that's the last communication that Captain Cooper heard from Captain McSorley of the Fitzgerald. He disappeared from the Anderson's radar screen, and fearing the worst, Captain Cooper put out a distress call to the Coast Guard and other vessels in the area. I've lost contact with the Fitzgerald. I think she's gone down. Down here in the protection of Whitefish Bay, there were 7 or 8 vessels anchored riding out the storm in the protection of Whitefish Bay. One of the vessels down there was our vessel, the William Clay Ford. Captain Don Erickson was in the protection of the bay, and he received the call from the Coast Guard and Captain Cooper about the Fitzgerald, and they asked him, could he go out and possibly look for any survivors? And Captain Erickson's reply was, if I go out there, you're going to have 2 ships on the bottom. But he decided he would raise his anchor, risk his life, his ship, and his crew, and go out to look for any survivors that evening. He searched until dawn, and Captain Erickson said the only thing they saw out there were 2 ducks in that evening. Some wreckage did turn up, which is up at the Whitefish Point Museum now. But in fact, the Fitzgerald did go down with all hands. All 29 men went down with the ship, and this was November 10th, 1975. It's important to remember through all this how dangerous these waters are in the Great Lakes. There's anywhere, people estimate anywhere between 6,000 and 10,000 shipwrecks on these lakes throughout the centuries. So they are very, very dangerous waters, especially in the fall or late fall when they're pushing the limits of the system of the season. So they did. The ship did go down. They circled for a while, didn't find anything, and then our ship, the William Clay Ford, was released by the Coast Guard, and they went on their way. So through all of this, what it tells us, not only were the lakes dangerous this time of the year, but captains would always push the season and carry heavier loads. Some people thought that maybe Captain McSorley took too big of a load. And there's a lot of speculation as to what happened that night, why the ship went down. Of course, there were heavy seas, terrible wind conditions. It was dark, it was nighttime. And so the Coast Guard official report, one of them was that some of the hatches along the Fitzgerald's deck were not properly dogged down or sealed down, and they were shipping water, of course, over the sides the whole time, which freighters do in heavy seas, and water was getting into the hold and it was slowly filling up. I don't know, it seems like that'd be a lot. Each one of those covers weighs from 3 to 4 tons. Even if they weren't properly dogged, it seems to me to be tough to get that all down, but I'm not an expert on it by any means. But I subscribe to Captain Don Erickson, the captain of our ship, his theory. He was out there that night. He thinks Captain McSorley got a little too close to Caribou Island over here in Lake Superior. And there's an area around there called 6 Fathom Shoals, and he thinks that the Fitzgerald touched down in one of the troughs of the waves, because we had waves anywhere from 35 to almost 40-foot seas out there, taller than this building. And he might have loosened up some plates on the bottom of the Fitzgerald, and he was slowly taking on water. And out in those confused seas, it's nighttime. Captain McSorley's just trying to drive his ship and keep it going, not realizing it was maybe getting lower and lower and lower in the water until one big wave hit it and it went down in seconds. Some people ask me, why didn't they put on their life jackets? Well, they had about 4 seconds and they were headed for the bottom. So that didn't give you, if you're down the engineering spaces or sleeping quarters or something, you didn't have a chance. The ship was headed for the bottom. So that's Captain Erickson's theory. Also, Captain Erickson thought that he overloaded the ship. He had about 28,000 tons of taconite or iron ore for that cargo, which might have been a little bit too much for that time of the season, especially in bad weather. So that's just one of the theories. The other, over here, you can see in our diorama the William Clay Ford up at the surface, and of course the Fitzgerald on the bottom is broken in two. It might have snapped going down, or might have broken in two when it hit the bottom. Of course, it's plunging at about 30 or 40 knots like a rock. So the stern section is upside down, the forward section's upright. There's no way they can really determine what the bottom of the hull looked like, because it's buried in about 20 feet of mud, so they really don't know if, in fact, some plates had loosened up. But it's in about 530 feet of water, which is pretty deep, but you think the Fitzgerald is 730 feet long. If you stood it on end, it would have stuck out of the water. But it is still pretty deep. I don't know anything about skin diving, but expert divers dive on this. From what I understand, it takes them maybe 30 minutes to get down there and then 2 hours to come back up, because they have to decompress. So People can go down there, but it's considered a grave site. You can't remove or touch the vessel because it is considered a grave site. However, some divers went down and did remove the bell off the top of the Fitzgerald's pilot house. They brought it up, and they had a replica made, exact replica of the bell with all 29 sailors, names engraved on it, and they took it back down and welded it back to the vessel itself. The original bell is up at the Whitefish Point Museum today. There is a lifeboat up there too from it. But again, this tells us what the conditions can be like on the lake, especially late in the season or early in the spring. Very dangerous waters. We've had shipwrecks right out here on this Detroit River and on Lake St. Clair. So the thousands of men have gone down. Even if the Fitzgerald, prior to that, in 1958, we had the Carl D. Bradley went down. 35 of 33 sailors went down in Lake Michigan. Then we had the Cedarville that went down just off the Straits of Mackinac, right off the Mackinac Bridge, where 10 sailors went down. I think 35 were rescued on the Cedarville. It broke in half. And then in 1966, these are all November of 1966, the Daniel J. Morrell went down, which was an odd one. It was going along and the ship just broke in half. And both sections stayed up. And all of a sudden, the men in the forward section looked, they said, here comes a ship to rescue us. It was the aft end of the ship was still going on its own after it snapped in half. And then the ship went down. So it was really strange. Here's the forward section, and the aft section was coming at it because it had snapped and turned around. It was still under power. And then it did go down. All but one perished on that one. 3 men got into a lifeboat, and 2 froze to death. The one man that survived, it's amazing that he did survive. He just had a T-shirt on or whatever. The 2 men froze to death with him. 1 man did survive off the Daniel J. Morrell. I think his name was Alan Hale, or I think his last name was Hale. But anyway, so those are the most recent ones. But like I said, there's been thousands of men that have gone down on these lakes, which tells us how dangerous they are. So now we are in the upper level of the pilot house, or wheelhouse as they call it, because here's the wheel for steering the ship. This is where you drive the ship. Up here would be the captain, usually perched right here in the middle window. You have the helmsman up here who steers the ship, and you'd have a second or third mate up here with the captain. So there's like 3 people up here most of the time. Different pieces of equipment up here for driving the ship. This was a little bit added later, but after the ship had been in service for a while. It's the auto helm, and you could plot in a course on that, and the ship would steer itself, especially out on the big lakes. And the helmsman would just sit back and the ship would drive itself. You have a gyro compass that's tied into the auto helm, and the magnetic compass here on the binnacle, an actual magnetic compass. Interesting thing on the front here, there's a tube here, and it's called a fielder's tube. And when they're loading iron ore, adds a lot more metal to the ship. Of course, the ship's all metal, and it could send the magnetic compass out of whack. So they could compensate with putting these little pucks in here to compensate to keep the magnetic north on the compass. Like I said, this is state-of-the-art 1984. Different pieces of equipment like the radio rangefinder over there. It was an older piece of equipment they probably didn't use much anymore. You triangulate with using radio signals to find out your position, but they had long-range and short-range radar on the vessel, so you could know your positions in fog or at night. Important piece of equipment right here is called the telegraph, or Chadburn, and this is to signal the engine room, which you have to remember is 767 feet aft, long ways away. So you would signal to the engine room, because you didn't have direct control of the ship. You'd have to use the telegraph, or Chadburn, to tell the chief engineer in the engine room what you wanted to do with the engines. Push it in this direction, it would be move the ship forward, put the ship forward direction, and what speed, or reverse, and what speed, or finished with engines to tell them what to do. So it's a Chadburn or telegraph. Usually when the kids are here, I say, okay, who's seen the movie Titanic? You know, yes, you probably saw the captain using one of these. It's the same thing, a telegraph or Chadburn. Well, another thing too, though, there's these couple of tubes here, and they're called spit tubes. The kids always go, oh, spit tubes. You didn't really spit in them, but you could yell down. They're just tubes. This one goes to the windlass room where the anchor is, and this one goes down to the captain's quarter. So you could always yell down there and wake the captain up if necessary. Over here is a switch for the whistle. Big whistle, which should be down in the stack in the back, and this is the emergency one. This was a cable that operated the whistle. A cable went all the way to the back of the ship to the whistle. There's another telegraph over there for when the captain's in port, and he can be by the windows there and control the ship. Kids ask me, what's with the drinking fountain? Did you put that there? I said, no, this is the way the ship was. It's an artifact. The drinking fountain was here for the crew. Kids ask me sometimes, what's this handle for up here? On top, up on the roof of the pilot house, there's a loudspeaker up there, and there was a microphone. The captain could bark orders to the men on shore, or whatever, the line handlers or whatever, with that. Over here, there's another one. This one goes up to a searchlight on the roof. Of course, the radios were up here, and I said this is state-of-the-art 1984. Nowadays, ships have GPS, and they know exactly any place on the planet where they are in terms of their positioning. So they're a lot more high-tech. Some ships don't even have the Chadburn anymore. They have direct drives that go right down to the engines, so it bypasses using the telegraph. So the technology has changed quite a bit. This was, like I mentioned downstairs, this is the pilot house forward. Most of the ships do not have pilot house forward anymore. They're all in the back. This ship was 767 feet long. It carried ore for almost all of its career to the Ford Motor Company to build cars. Nowadays we have vessels that are 1,000 feet long, and those replaced like a couple of these or some of the smaller freighters. So there are less freighters on the lakes than there used to be, just because we have these 1,000-footers that handle tremendous cargoes. So there's just not as many ships as there were at one time. But we get a lot of salties coming from across the ocean through the Welland Canal, bringing all types of different cargoes and so forth. But another thing too is Captain Erickson was a stickler about having food or drinks or anything up here, because he always kept a neat ship, a tidy ship. But some guys were here working, came by here a couple of summers ago that used to work on this vessel, and they said, Captain Erickson, there's a locker right there in the chart room on the corner there, and he used to keep cookies in there that he would slip in there and he'd grab cookies every now and then. Over here we have the phones for communicating with different parts of the ship. The other thing I forgot to mention were these two handles over here. This is the bow thruster and the stern thruster, which are propellers that go transversely through the ship to maneuver the ship in port, so you don't need to use a tugboat to come in and push you to shore or maneuver you. The quicker you could get to the shore and unload your cargo or load your cargo, the better, because these ships were, like I said earlier, are big dump trucks. The faster that they can load or unload their cargoes, the better. They could make anywhere from 30 to 40, 45 trips a season, depending on when the ice breaks up or forms. And the cheaper they could do it, the better, the more profits that they could make. Captain Erickson, this was his chair over here. And fortunately for him, he passed away about 3 years ago, I think now, and he could come here every November when we have our Lost Mariners Remembrance by the Fitzgerald anchor outside. In November, he could come and sit in his old pilot house, which was really cool because his old ship is gone, but his pilot house was here, and he could come up and talk and tell stories and so forth. So it was pretty nice for him. But this is an artifact. The museum didn't make this. It's actually off the vessel itself. Okay, we're still on the upper level of the pilot house. We're in the chart room now, and on land we call the maps on water, on ships, they're called charts. And these big drawers would hold the charts of the lakes Captain Erickson would use to navigate around the lakes. That's what the obvious name of the room, the chart room. A lot of kids will ask me, what's the couch for? I say, well, maybe if Captain Erickson wanted to take a little nap, he'd sit down there and or lay down there if he wanted to. But this is, of course, that locker where he would stow away some cookies and so forth. This was a depth sounder over here. They had a radio in here also, ship to shore, so forth. But this was looking aft. Through these windows, you'd be looking aft to the back of the ship, and this is the forward section. Looking forward, of course, but I've always thought it'd be neat if we had these backlit windows they could have in here showing, like they were pictures of the back of the ship. Because a lot of people don't realize this was, up high and looking aft. And all the cargo holds would have been in between for loading and unloading the ship.